Hello everyone, today we talk about Gerbert d'Aurillac and the school of Chartres. So recently I talked about the Roman Church in Gerbert of Aurillac, and that was a video that can serve a little bit, even I wouldn't say as an introduction because it really talks about also other things, but especially the second part about Gerbert is kind of it goes in parallel with some things we're going to talk about him now. And this video is just a reflection essentially on how between essentially the tent, the second half of the tent and beginning of the 11th century, Christian European, say Western Christian European, or also just Western European at this point, because not that there were pagan entities proper, dominating the scenario at this point, was developing its kind of its view of the world. It's a 360 degrees view of the world, talking about theology naturally, but also what this entailed for these Christians back in the day in terms of science or relation, the feeling of what humanity had to be into this world, and the development of knowledge and ideals that were essentially to give a great boost also to the philosophical production in as it would be evident also in the following centuries. So discussing about this revival, we have seen in that other video how essentially the figure of Gerbert d'Aurillac had deeply contributed to this. Now we will arrive to him in a while, but it's also the premises that brought also to Gerbert activity that are important to mention, because this reflourishing or this blooming again of dialectics as a discussion, a rational discussion method essentially, was not anything completely anew at that point. Especially this revival was emerging from the urban schools that were created in essentially in the same place where the canonical capitoli were at this point. And so these were schools of thought where very often, at least, it was a much more dynamic and also opened mindset than in for instance, the monastic schools. So this is kind of paradoxical sometimes, because I personally like very much the monastic ideal in theory, also especially in this idea of a contemplation and but chiefly from an intellectual point of view. I mean, the idea that the retirement is functional also to the understanding, the studying, the learning. This is very evident in the monastic schools, but those weren't the only one. And if you look at the diversity, the dynamism of society, definitely the canonical schools at a point were definitely the place where maybe not excessively the idea of studying, of learning, was necessarily more active than in the monasteries, but it was less unscrupulous in some occasions. In fact, most of the problems that eventually emerged from this intellectual revival, especially in the 12th century, would stem essentially from this too daring idea, this open mindset that for the more traditional Christian views of the time were even thought-provoking in kind of an excessive way. Excuse me, I said one thing right. But what I mean is that the world of the city was more dynamic, was a world that essentially looked also at more events that was at the center, especially in certain regions of Europe where in fact cities were more developed, of politics and also international politics. And there is this great difference objectively, as always existed, between also monastic career and the secular clergy. So two different world views that sometimes even conflicted, definitely, and were eventually this conflict was to be increased. For instance, when the monasteries were transferred into the cities into the 13th century with the mendicant orders and so on. So a very complex relation, especially at this time, where the secular clergy was essentially part of the same elites. I mean, theoretically, well, maybe the opportunity of career were kind of the same, but indeed the urban centers like the bishoprics, and so on, were kind of more prestigious sometimes in certain monasteries. Not much, because the monastery could be very, very powerful as well, but the monastery was tendentially more tied to certain more local dynamics than this secular clergy, secular environment revolving around the dioceses practically was. And there was a compenetration, definitely. Even the figure of Gerbert Aurillac is pretty evident in this, because he was also an abbot, not just a bishop and archbishop, as we'll see. And we can say that the taste for the reasoning, the logical reasoning and argumentation was already present since the Carolingian times. Especially there is this great figure that is John Scotus Aurillac, who lived during the 9th century, was an Irish monk, theologian and philosopher, and who is considered, in fact, to have been one of the greatest early medieval or high medieval, depending on when it was started to count down, the early medieval, let's say, philosophers, and also thanks to his speculative contribution. Think about the Periphysean, for instance. And he also was the famous translator of the work of the Pseudo Dionysius, that had this huge importance, in fact, also into the school of Chartres, and generally up to also was at the base of, in fact, of the speculative revival in philosophy at this point. And would actually continue to have a very great influence up to the very end of the Middle Ages. So maybe we don't concentrate on his figure, because we're not talking about him. But it's pretty obvious that in a Christian society, Eriugenes' conclusion that philosophy and theology are essentially the same thing was to produce some important consequences, and there was also the theory of the four natures, that is that in fact it's the Periphysean, that actually is also known as the Divisione Naturae in Latin, that is obviously of Neoplatonic derivation, that integrates the Christian concept of the natural person of God as creator of the world into the Neoplatonic system. So there are certain propositions like that. I don't know. There are essentially four divisions of the divine being, and the first one is the nature, the uncreated and creating nature, which is the God Father, essentially. The created and creating nature, that is the Logos, that is the Son that proceeds from the Godfather. Then the creating and not creating nature, that is real material reality, essentially physics, so framed into the world, into space and time. And then nature, non-creating and non-created nature, that is God himself at this point, that is conceived as what basically the whole created universe, the whole creation, say better, is tending to. It's trying essentially to reach. So you see here a complex philosophical system that was looking at the deeper nature, in fact, of reality. So rediscovering a bit this from the Hellenic, the classical philosophy, essentially, how the human being could look at the world. And in fact, John Scotus Eriugena, in this sense, was also a great supporter of human freedom, in also taking, very importantly also from St. Augustine, certain ideas for which also in here there is a great a part of great interest, because it deals with certain matters of predestination, for instance. Unlike Augustine, actually, Eriugena sustained that basically there was no predestination proper, that is intended as predestinate, literally, because God doesn't exist nor before nor afterwards, practically. So it's Eriugena basically affirmed that human will cannot be conditioned in any way, while he takes from St. Augustine that evil is not a reality but a non-being, and therefore God doesn't know evil, because if he knew, he would create it, because the thought and the action of God basically are kind of the same thing. I mean, everything that is conceived by God is created. So practically, and this is also typically Neoplatonic idea, is that that evil is the absence of perfection, or a sort of negation or denial of reality. So as a consequence, Eriugena said that in God there can't be at all the prescience of the evil of man, and therefore that there can't be any predestination to evil. So the main characteristics of mankind is, for Eriugena, the free will. That is, this faculty, this possibility is given to sin or not to sin. So being human, the human being free, he can basically enjoy the help of divine grace. And this actually was, these are very, I'm simplifying, of course, but these are very tricky grounds, because eventually Eriugena was also accused of being Pelagianism, for which basically it was basically heretical Christian doctrine that's affirmed that the original sin is proper just of the individual progenitors, so of Adam and Eve, but not of their descendants. So this is naturally very, very, very complicated at best, euphemistically, to support in knowing the Christian doctrine and the same Bible objectively. So, but what the point I was trying to make in here is that it's how from this 9th, 10th century, there was already a revival into the Western European thought towards the reconsideration of human being into the world in a kind of propositive way. In the idea that the human mind could objectively not just fear and respect God and expect this kind of complete obedience, but also going beyond and actually seeing as a seeing it as a moral duty to explore the world that God has given to mankind, and essentially for understanding it also at a from a physical or metaphysical level in some cases. And this had contributed. I mean, this text circulated. They weren't abandoned. They were something, episodic. That objectively, the Carolingian influence had been important in this context. And this tendency was this how do you wanna this current, as you wanna call it, basically was revived, was refreshed. A little bit after the mid of the 10th century in the Cathedral School of Rheims, and this was the place where Gerbert Aurillac came to be. He was one of the greatest learned one of the greatest erudites of the time. We can make a bit of story of him, also repeating it. Also, I did it also in the other video, but it can be useful. He came from Aquitaine, and this was very important also geographically, because Aquitaine was exposed to so many different cultural stimuli. Gerbert had studied also in Spain, very close, by the way, to the Caliphate world of Cordoba, so it was a great ferment, that was one of the cultural capitals of the time, and Gerbert would become, in fact, at Rheims, in fact, in turn, a master of dialectics, and reconnecting with this ancient philosophical tradition that through the works of Boethius was essentially living on also through, as we've seen, the Carolingian times, and being revived, re-explored. And at that same time, Gerbert also the occasion in Ravenna, in Italy, were to basically participate to a great public discussion debate about philosophy, the importance of philosophy, at the presence, by the way, of the Germanic Emperor Otto II. Actually pretty substantial crowd of clergymen that were extremely curious about the new knowledge that was pouring in now from the outside of Europe. I made many videos on Schwerpunkt some month ago now, dealing with the recovery of the classical knowledge mediated by the Muslim thought into Europe, especially from the 12th century, but this is something that began very early in time. There is actually no solution. We can argue that this exchange had always existed. So Europe at this point was already being exposed to such coming back in a way from of this knowledge that even if you think about the times, it's not so excessively far away. I mean, the idea that for instance, we are here in essentially in the second half of the 10th century. The Roman Empire had fallen into the Western one, at least in the second half of the 5th. Now, actually, Boethius, all these great scholars were still in the West in the 6th century, so that late antique classical culture was still alive in spite of everything. So it's just how much is this? It is basically just 400 years. So it's not an enormous time objectively. There is not this gap. Sometimes we like to stress this. I don't know. The Middle Ages basically, at a certain point, the Roman Empire suddenly stopped. Everybody became ignorant, and nobody talked anymore with anyone. But this is not evidently not true. Even the same Carolingian Empire, where scholars like Scotus Erugena had worked, was even before. It was essentially only, in the case of Scotus, it was in the 9th, so basically was 300 years only from those times. So there was a continuity. It was something, an intellectual production, at least an intellectual potential, kind of burning under the ashes and being capable of being revived, essentially, by these influxes. So this actually speaks for the the ability of the Western Europe not at all to be simply a passive container, a passive receiver of informations, of knowledge from the Eastern world. This is the narrative that you hear used in this silly positivistic idea that, I don't know, that there are ages that are inherently dark and backwards and even inferior, even if I don't even know at this point what it would mean, what it's supposed to mean, and that it takes someone who, the enlightened, advanced. This is typically I won't go too far defining this in a certain way, but it's wrong at so many levels at this point in history for what we know historiographically, scientifically, about how human societies work and how they are. So I'm not saying that Europe at this point was being was more advanced than the East, intellectually speaking. I didn't. I actually made a video in which I also discussed the cultural influence of medieval Islam at this point, exactly in these centuries, and how important it was, in fact, also for Western Europe to develop a renewed thought, in a renewed speculation, philosophical speculation, and so on. But it's still true that the these figures, like Gerbert d'Aurillac, these schools, like in Reims or in Chartres, as we will see now, weren't coming, out of the blue. Weren't an anomaly that we can't explain. We know actually that at this point, also thanks to monasticism, thanks also to the revived Ottonian Empire that contributed also very much ideologically to catalyze, to attract scholars at the Germanic court and so on, to put in motion basically the knowledge that was already there, that had been it was never forgotten, but it wasn't at that point, it hadn't found a direct need of application. Also in here you have to understand not much, the interest in the intellectual speculation just for the sake of it. You also have to take into consideration the needs, the social dynamics that brought to such ideas to be put out there. And this is a moment actually which there was a lot of theory of ideological development also at many levels. If you take Spain, for instance, if you take England, at this time there were areas, for instance, in which the ideology of power, the ideology of kingship, and even of empire was revived. The idea is that naturally the Carolingian and the Ottonian worlds of this mostly Central European continental powers, dynasties, had definitely reinvigorated, for instance, the imperial ideology, the justification of its power, its relation with God. It was all one with this. So even centers like the Anglo-Saxon court or the kingdom of Leon at this point were not immune from this, and there were all these external stimuli, chiefly from the Islamic and Byzantine world, that were reinforcing the need of this. And there are also social reasons now, and they're a bit of complex to express, but everything happens for a reason, and historically speaking we have to at least to try to understand that reason. And the work of Boethius, as you understand, especially with the Consolazione Philosophiae, so the consolation that philosophy can produce also in this moment of naturally here the mindset, the European mindset, was a bit different, because that was a work that was written in a particular context, also in a lifestyle of Boethius, in a moment of which was acknowledged the loss, the decline of certain of certain notions, of certain education that was about to happen, essentially, that in that mid-6th century. Now philosophy is taken, so that philosophy was taking a sort of refuge also, not a denial of the world, but let's say as a sort of medicine to take into a moment in which naturally society was undergoing very dramatic situations, dramatic dynamics. Not everywhere, really, because also the passage to the early medieval times in certain realities was much less traumatic than we can imagine. As a matter of fact, most of the times it wasn't traumatic at all. I mean, there had been other things that happened before that were, even worse. So that's not the point. At this point, instead, it's the reverse. It's at this point the same Westerners retaking, in part, with these enlightened minds, if you want, like Gerbert, like Aurillac before him, and the century before, that were reproposing philosophy as not in a passive sense, I mean, as a refuge, but also as a tool to actively explore the world, to actually look at it and say, okay, we as Christians have a duty to look at this world. And there was also a lot of criticism, especially towards Gerbert, that was kind of considered kind of an unscrupulous also in the way he was handling the new knowledge, because in that video I kind of explained it decently. I hope that Gerbert was a very unique intellectual for his times, because he was a complete intellectual. He wasn't just a theologian. He got interested in so many things, so many disciplines, like maths, like music, like natural science, like astronomy. And this in later times also developed this kind of black legion about him. That Gerbert eventually became Pope Sylvester II, so he's kind of a magician that he, through this occult even knowledge, made it to the top of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, just to rule the world. All these various plot conspiration theories existed at all times. If you if you want to be kind of it's a kind of a mild consolation that humans have always fallen for such ideas, but behind this there is actually the objective reason that Gerbert was now a complete intellectual that wanted to know everything, not just what was known at that point from a strictly Christian education, and therefore looking at the world. And this is important because today we would differentiate two things. Today we reason in dichotomies like religion and science, which is wrong in my opinion also at this time, but I won't discuss now the point. But at that time were quite evidently actually the very same thing. I mean, the major criticism at that point arrived mostly from an intrinsic attitude that had existed, in fact, up to that point, that was into the Christian world. It was essentially to say, okay, you have to stay humble whatever it happens. Essentially, you have to accept just the Bible. I mean, this kind of even integralist view of religion, for which all you need is the Bible. You didn't need anything else. But it's kind of minimalist. It's kind of even more. It's soaked with skepticism and so on. Instead, Christian philosophy during the Middle Ages would, in fact, evolve massively structurally, even with this kind of problems, with kind of a resistance and attrition from the most reactionary elements of the church, towards an omnicomprehensive kind of universalistic view of the world. And indeed, this new philosophy, this new dialectics especially, was now posing certain problems that had in fact existed also back in the day, also in a non-Christian context. Back in the classical world. In classical world, had been essentially the same thing. All these Greek philosophers were thinking about the universe and so on. They were seen by traditional religion at that point into the Hellenic were kind of atheists, or people who essentially were overthinking about things that didn't matter, while all that mattered was to appease the gods. And here it wasn't, after all, extremely different. It was just in a monotheistic context. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. Hence, the figure of Gerbert, and also other we quoted before, were kind of certain path openers for the greater developments of the medieval philosophy. Excuse me. I'm always healthy. It's just this damn spring with all this stuff that makes me cough and sneeze all the time. So Gerbert's career is also pretty much known. He made this this cursus honorum that was at that point probably the brightest career you could do. He became Archbishop of Rheims. You know that Rheims had this extremely important role into the crowning at the of the this point Western Frankish kings that had a great spiritual prestige. It was also a very powerful archdiocese object. Really, then eventually he became Archbishop of Ravenna. That was also one of the most important archbishoprics of Christianity at the time. Also, kind of naturally relatively close to Rome, and being also in contrast with Rome traditionally. But at this point, the Ottonians had managed basically to co-opt the hierarchical elites of the Italic kingdom, so that basically they controlled also this kind of internal infight between and jealousy between the various seats. And by will of Emperor Otto III, a Roman pontiff, a Roman pope with the name of Sylvester II. And Gerbert was admired all over the world, the Christian world, and also partly beyond, because you know that as Sylvester II, Gerbert promoted very actively also the conversion of several populations into Europe that were still pagan at the time. He also went beyond kind of the vision that the Ottonians had taken for them. Gerbert d'Aurillac was extremely important for also putting the kind of the seeds of the Gregorian reform, even if it was kind of probably very far from his intentions. But this was feasible because he had set into the church the idea that this had to be a guide, also an intellectual guide to the world. So something that went beyond the mere, at that point, political game that essentially the church had become, especially since the Ottonians had made it basically to domesticate the church and kind of appointing all the ecclesiastical figures that they pleased to maintain the order into the empire, but in Germany and into Italy, and now the church was with this high intellectual figure that was imitated for centuries actually afterwards as a model of the perfect pope essentially within the church. It was also acquired by the papacy, the idea that the papacy had to be kind of intellectually, it's difficult to define. I would say intellectually free, but also encompassing. The idea that the knowledge of the church had to go beyond, had to arrive to dominate essentially the world into a vision that went beyond even the same one of the empire. In practice, that was increasingly seen instead as a sort of very very earthly affair at that point, despite of obviously all the respect and the acknowledgement of the imperial authority towards imperial authority was needed on Earth, and this is really the point, is that also Sylvester II and Otto III kept actually cooperating in this vision that at this point derived from the ideological horizons of the Roman universalism. And within these horizons, the religious and political reasons found a further reason of a comfort within the universal meaning and the ancient universal meaning of a culture that basically revolved around the figure of Gerbert. He was educated with the classical works. And at the same time, Otto III was kind of also the same, in part the same symbol of classicism, of classical legacy from a political point of view, as he had received a classical education from his mother, that was the Byzantine princess Theophano, who had brought, and of the same Gerbert, by the way, who had also educated him, that clearly declared the solemn Mediterranean origin of this knowledge. So, you know that Otto III was among the Ottonian emperors the one that the most lived its Roman meaning, his Roman identity in a way, because he was half Byzantine. He lived in Rome for a long time. He wanted to make, just basically as all the Roman emperors of the Holy Roman emperors afterwards, of Rome the real center of the empire. This is, if you want to understand the Holy Roman Empire, you have to understand it wasn't at all meant to be a German thing. That's something that starts happening only from the 14th century. The universalism was as much alive as the idea that the emperors had to rule from the city of Rome proper, not just as a symbol, but also strategically speaking, because ruling Italy at this point meant to rule also the Mediterranean, and kind of nobody succeeded, as we know, in achieving this for many reasons, including naturally, well, now it's complicated to explain, but also the papacy eventually was to acquire partly this awareness that they could make kind of to make the balance into the peninsula of who was to rule in there. So now this is just kind of the 2 generations before, but figures like Gerbert, while the Ottonian dynasty eventually faded, it went extinguished now, and eventually with the Salians, the church was living on and heading towards this direction of reform. That it was actually stressed by the same Ottonians at one point, because that's how they had justified initially actually the intervention into the ecclesiastical matters. The idea was that basically they wanted to take especially Rome away from the local aristocracies, but in turn basically putting their own figures in there, their own major ecclesiastical men of power, essentially in charge of the ecclesiastical offices, the trustees of the dynasty, and to control the local communities. And this was partly also the reason why behind this hypocrisy, that however was also very functional politically speaking, because objectively the Ottonians had managed almost to control the Italic kingdom in its entirety, in part, let's say. But it eventually brought to the same ideal of reform, the idea that okay, this control is also excessive because it was being exercised by a secular, a secular power like the empire over the Church of Rome. That instead, this point was already starting to sense its own something that went beyond the mere primacy or just spiritual spiritual prestige, and was essentially to go beyond and to claim a sort of sovereignty even on the same secular powers. That is very, very important. Ideologically speaking, it's the base of the same Gregorian reform. So, another thought maybe about Gerbert of Aurillac would be kind of interesting, although here I'm facing some he just for him in biographical data, he was born around 940 and died in 1003, and he essentially discussed his own his career. We didn't say he became abbot of the great monastery of St. Columba at Bobbio in northern Italy. It was Otto II basically backed in here. What very important about Gerbert is something we said also in the other videos, basically his origins. He was educated actually at the Benedictine monastery excuse me, of Saint-Géraud d'Aurillac in Auvergne, and he was eventually entrusted to the Catalan Borel. And he Gerbert actually went to Rome, I think the first time, with him. Gerbert wasn't of a great he didn't have a great he was not coming from a very wealthy family at all. I mean, it also shows partly how you could make a career in the clergy at this point relatively easily if you have the intelligence, because basically Gerbert was considered a genius, and the church was as well as any other, including the empire, were searching for these individuals who were smart, who were extremely cultured, and that therefore could back also their ideologies and so on. And also, Gerbert's experience in Rome was very important because this reinforced his kind of humanistic education and also his mathematical culture, by the way. And he was kept in there, in fact, by the same Pope John XIII. And then that's when eventually he knew the Archdeacon Grumnus of Rheims. This man was basically he taught logics in Rheims, and then that's where Gerbert followed him in 972 in Rheims, and he taught himself in there, as we've said, and also at that point he was collecting frenetically a huge amount of manuscripts of codes that he and this also shows already in the 10th century how active this work of research of collection of manuscripts was pretty alive. So the Europeans at this point were kind of retaking also what they had in their own same monasteries, kind of comparing them, crossing them. A lot of this philosophical development came objectively from this activity, from the idea of that the manuscript was not just that had to be preserved, but it's something that could be used for the knowledge that was present into it, for something for an active use, for something that could also go beyond the content of the same manuscript. and Gerbert had been also very, very important for the rise of the Capetian dynasty. Is also a very important part, because together with the Archbishop of Aldborough in Reims, Gerbert kind of guided French politics, and he brought to the throne Hugh Capetus, basically, and he backed him against the efforts of Charles of Lorraine to depose him. So eventually he became Archbishop of Ravenna, and he had a huge impact also in the ideal of the Renovatio Imperii that was being pursued by the young Otto the Third, and that's why he also, after 1 year, he was elected Pope, and he also had this. He maintained actually his ties with Rome. He kept controlling, and he promoted the evangelization of Poland, of Hungary. He reproposed essentially this theoretical project of restoration of the Christian Empire, centered on Rome, centered in Rome. So you understand also, this is why I was saying before that, in spite of the cooperation that existed with Otto III, such a program was objectively going beyond the essentially German basis of the Ottonian Empire. And even with the same situation of Rome, proper as a city and its aristocracies and so on. And that's the reason why objectively he didn't see, and there were probably not even the preconditions for seeing this ideal to be basically achieved in practice. But nevertheless, as a great erudite, his effort in the philosophical and theological field was extremely important to assimilate and coordinate ancient knowledge in a unique Christian vision. And that's why also this effort that is really remarkable, because it's a great work of synthesis, was seen as too ambitious, and that's why he was believed eventually in the 11th and in the 12th centuries that he might have been also a magician or even an heretic who wanted to basically reach everything and the great discover the great treasures of the ancient Rome together with the devil and all this kind of stuff. And there are actually even some works that remain of Gerbert, besides a very precious epistolary. There is a treatise on geometry and other philosophical and theological works. So the figure of Gerbert, we haven't actually gone in depth. You know, in Schwerpunkt now I'm not making really biographies or something like that, but definitely in the future we will have also to go a bit in detail to that, because this is really too few as a presentation. But it's important for me to talk about him because it's kind of an overlooked figure in history, and it was very, very important for the further developments of the church in this kind of universal view of the world, this confidence that existed. Now, also intellectually, to develop a new ideology of a new approach to the world, also politically speaking. And dialectics, that was a bit of the base of all this, because everything at this point was proven on the base of mostly a monastic science at this point didn't quite exist as such. Naturally, we've seen how Gerbert was passionate also about so many disciplines such as medicine, mathematics, astronomy, the laws of music, that were also or still believed to be all in one greater frame within the Christian world. And or better, Gerbert was now had been now strengthening these conceptions and essentially looking at you can say that they hadn't that such fields of knowledge hadn't been thought in such a way, because objectively also St. Augustine had written the Musica, for instance, on music, and there was still this idea, but up to that point nobody had actually managed to have to synthesize everything in this fashion and to essentially build it as trying to reconnect everything to a broader organic conception of the world, together with naturally in a Christian frame. This required a great deal of theoretical activity, and at that point the only branch of knowledge that could in a certain sense back these ideas was dialectics. I mean, in dialectics, in a moment where, in fact, as I said, science was still kind of more empirical than in a way, and the main problem was also to frame the scientific knowledge into a more solid conception, a more solid structure. It was dialectics that was now being developed, and during the Carolingian era also there had been a criticism towards the unscrupulous use of dialectics. I mean, there's also these nominalistic problems for which what you say is, how you use the language is it really meant to describe the world? Do things really exist as such? Are there categories of interpretations? Sometimes we're also very unscrupulous word games that recall the second sophistry of the classical times. At this point, we're being revived. So there was a lot of criticism, also chiefly because of this, we would say, but in general, I mean, also from the same idea of wanting to dominate such an immense knowledge that was seen as, in the case of Gerbert, as essentially as a proof of of arrogance, substantially, of non-Christian or Christian incompatible attitude, this pride and haughtiness that were inconceivable. So for many, the Bible had to be substantially enough, but evidently even these ideas couldn't be stamped. I mean, if you look at medieval philosophy objectively, there was always this attempt not to make certain thoughts to spread too fast, not to control also the orthodoxy of certain attitudes, certain beliefs. But on the other hand, you see that when certain texts began to circulate, there's certain new texts, think about Aristotle, not now, but in the following centuries, and how this was studied, even if it had been forbidden by the church everywhere, and exactly in the School of Theology of Paris, that point was the greatest theological school in Europe. That was, it was useless, because exactly these more educated clergymen, these scholars that were the same ones who were supposed, in fact, to teach orthodoxy and Catholic doctrine, and etc., were practically the same ones. Now we had the greatest curiosity, and also the intellectual tools to read certain texts of complex philosophical systems, like the one of in fact of Aristotle at the time, so that the church eventually, with the scholastics, gave up and said we can't stem Aristotle anymore. We have to integrate this knowledge in Aristotelian physics and metaphysics into the Christian doctrine. At least adapting it, of course, but essentially making it our own, because objectively was seen as a viable option, and that naturally took great minds like Thomas Aquinas to achieve this. But this is the point. You can't truly stem knowledge. I mean, it's impossible, basically. It's even a kind of a physical self-evidence, I believe. I mean, you can't keep even a certain community blocked, isolated, forcefully. I mean, there are surely it's kind of easier to condition a human being than you believe, but it's really the world society, the mass of it, that is still permeable to new beliefs, to new ideas. It's not going to remain the same. And even if you isolate a community from any kind of intellectual stimulus, still that community is capable of producing something like that. So it's basically impossible, especially at this time, in the high medieval period, for any authority whatsoever to impose to forbid essentially the reading of certain works or even their circulation. So in fact, something that is not usually very properly understood is when especially about talking about this kind of censorship and this the censorship that existed at the time was very, very different from the one we are used today. I mean, there is this kind of progressivistic idea for which, I don't know, the Middle Ages were such a which is completely unhistorical. The idea that the Middle Ages were just dominated by the church, for which everybody thought only what the Pope said and nobody could think anything else. This is completely anti-historical. The Middle Ages was completely boundless from this point of view. The problem, if anything, was there was a relatively few to know. But what you see in the Middle Ages is that as soon as new works began to circulate for dynamics that are essentially political or socio-economical most of the times, the authorities couldn't stand these things. That medieval mentality was extremely flexible, was extremely capable of absorbing. This is also something we keep delude ourselves with. I mean, the idea that being more educated means to be more open-minded. It depends on what you learn and how you learn. I mean, a doctrinal person, a society that has a very highly structured conception of itself is way more likely to have problems to integrate further knowledge than a society that has relatively a few knowledge. Naturally, there are also other factors that bring to this, so I'm not saying that obviously education is needed for being open-minded, but this is the point I'm making. Into the Middle Ages, this happened, and it happened all the times. And the side that we don't see about this is not about the approach to knowledge in ideological terms. It's really the need for that knowledge, and the pragmatic nature that existed at this point. For us, for instance, it's inconceivable that these people were Christian, but they still wanted to know everything from all over the world, because I don't know, this kind of stereotypical idea that in fact Christianity is just, I don't know, just waving your own flag of your own religion and remaining into your tiny boundaries. This is absolutely not like that. The medieval man was historically the 30th man of knowledge in human history. There's never been a moment like in the Middle Ages in which man had this kind of inextinguishable thirst for knowledge. Because in all the other epochs, the approach to knowledge was radically different. Even during the Enlightenment, and I say this every time, the Enlightenment wasn't much interested in knowing more. It was interested in defining in categorizing. There was obviously an interest in knowing more, in the sapere aude, was ist Beantwortung der Fragen, was ist Aufklärung? That's pretty evident. But that was a word was more set into this problem than to the actual knowledge. It's in the medieval times, you didn't have such categories, you didn't have such boundaries. You were living in a world that had still to systematize all the knowledge. So the main problem is, how do we approach this? And given especially that there is still so much to know that keeps pouring into our and that was not pouring passively, it was actually being asked for these people. So these people had an active interest, an active will to know new things. They were coming also from worlds that had actually nothing to do with Christianity, because these were essentially classical thoughts mediated by Muslim philosophers. These Christians were perfectly fine with that. They loved to know about it, and were greatly open to all of this. So naturally, there are kind of certain negative sides also of what that society was at the time, the control that the church exercised on certain aspects of this process, but it was much less oppressive because simply there weren't the means to achieve it. And the point I'm making is that there was a very few that actually bothered the church in this sense, because one thing is, this is also something I say every time, is to just think about how many people were actually Christian at the time. How many people actually knew Christian theology. I mean, these people were seeing it now. Christianity was expanded even to countries like Poland, into Hungary. Now, these were formally, this was a Christian world, but how many people actually at that point knew about Christianity in its meaning? Do you think that peasants that lived, I don't know, in 10th century Germany or knew what Christianity was practically about? Obviously not, but obviously the church cared up to a certain point. The church had certain problems that stemmed also for the actual control of mostly the dioceses. It was mostly a political game. It was mostly a problem of elites, of especially this increasing conflict with the local aristocracies and the imperial authority. That was the real problem. Nobody actually cared what you read or didn't read. Until this didn't create, until this created didn't create a problem of, that someone was essentially putting into discussion the authority of the church. This is, for instance, what happened with the heresies of the 12th century. I mean, and this is also kind of a wrong historical assessment, because actually also these heresies weren't putting at all into discussion the authority of the church, because the church was always at the center of this mindset. The church as such, or the evangelical church. The problem was at this point the authority of Rome, its hierarchies, the way it practically worked, and not even here. I mean, actually most of the heresies of the 12th centuries weren't against the papacy at all. I mean, on the contrary, they wanted basically to reform it, to strengthen it, to make it purer. So, but this is also another digression. What I was saying is, this was an open world that couldn't be properly controlled fully from an intellectual point of view. And this is arguably where also the greatest achievements basically started to be obtained, because essentially you needed now to create a pattern, to create a net on which you could orientate, because previously there hadn't been. that there wasn't a systematic view of knowledge where just those 150 works that basically had survived from the late antique, and that was it practically. And even at this point, having 70 of them was into into a monastic library equated to be to have a half of the world knowledge at the time. So it was kind of also episodic, and there hadn't been up to that point mostly the need to intersect this knowledge, or to try to carve something, to build something on it that could somewhat somehow reconnect this whole wisdom in itself. And dialectics at this point was the mean to reconnect a bit all of this, and to start essentially going beyond the mere content, but also in creating something that could supersede it, could basically organize it, and to facilitate also the approach, the knowledge. So sometimes even theoretical speculations, as a matter of fact, were so theoretical to be criticized in its abstraction, because it was not concrete. Sometimes it was not, at least by certain standards, was not considered enough concrete for the actual Christian duties. And especially during the 11th century, dialectics expanded enormously into the various schools. And this was evident. We have seen how Gerbert of Aurillac pushed for this, how he left this legacy, this model, even as an individual that was a polymath essentially, and that had showed the way, in that sense, towards that direction. We've seen also the Carolingian times had set up these lines that and motives that had practically were practically being followed once again, always on the same track, and that were connecting this world with the knowledge was known at the time, deriving from the ancient times, to the ancient wisdoms, and now also being influenced, as we've said, by the Muslim reelaboration of this wisdom of essentially of Hellenic tradition. It was a bit of the base of the intellectual development of the classical world. So it was extremely important at this point. The cathedral school of Chartres, so for this seat that is southwest of Paris, and the great relevance of this school was to be intended both for the width of interests, but also of range of irradiation, practically of irradiation capacity of its ideas, and it was to flourish, especially during the 12th century. But it was already very famous at the beginning of the 11th, especially for the teaching of Fulbert of Chartres, who was a magister, so a teacher essentially, but also eventually bishop of Chartres himself. So maybe let's spend a word about both the school and Fulbert. I think, excuse me, I have some problems with this damn headphone that doesn't really help. But so what I'm trying to say is these processes were kind of very articulated. They weren't objectively things that developed from one day or another, but sometimes you see in history how even the figure of a single person can actually make the difference into developing into essentially making a direction, to point to a direction to be taken, and a certain others to be given, and also in shaping the mindset, the intellectual models, and so on. Naturally, you might argue why is that France became a bit the center of this. Well, it really depends. The idea is that France at this point was transforming very rapidly towards actually the kingdom that at this point actually would remain pretty weak up to the 13th century, objectively, for given the standards also of other entities that were forming. But that was very hierarchical in nature, intensely feudal. So there were these elites that really could afford also more resources to study, to create centers of learning of high level. So there is a great difference, for instance, from the theological schools in France and the studies, the juridical studies into Italy, because these were two different environments objectively. So especially for theology, this was fundamental for essentially backing also the monarchical prerogatives. The French monarchy at this point was extremely tied also to the local church and its archbishops that were essentially backing royal power. This was happening also elsewhere, for instance in Germany, because the church saw at that point its prerogatives comforted by the royal authority that was putting essentially a minimal balance to the excesses of the nobility that wanted to expand essentially into a very chaotic fashion practically. But this is also a general thought. The school of Chartres, however, if we want to talk about it in general, was definitely founded by the figure of Fulbert. Fulbert was we don't know actually much about him. We think, for instance, he was born in France, but we're actually not known. It had been believed that also he was born into Italy, but we don't really in Italy, but we don't really know. He was born, however, around 975. So you see also this moment which Gerbert of Aurillac was in his prime. He was developing as an intellectual, as making his career, and so on. And in fact, it's in Rheims that Fulbert became a student of Gerbert. So eventually Fulbert moved to Chartres, where he perfected essentially his studies, and he also practiced medicine, interestingly enough. So this field that up to that point hadn't been excessively developed, now was a bit of the vanguard of science. At that point, it was mostly coming from the Arab world, as in knowledge, in techniques, and so on. Mostly, and were also partly naturally inheriting the ancient medicine and in theory and in practice. Fulbert became a deacon and eventually a canonical and a chancellor, and he was entrusted the direction of the local school that therefore owes to him the great fame that it earned during medieval times. He was favored by King Robert, and by 1006 he was elected Bishop of Chartres, as we've seen. um, and there was a lot. It wasn't a very an entirely successful activity as a pastoral, essentially in ecclesiastical duties, but he never actually abandoned the teaching that at this point comprehended all the arts of the trivium, the quadrivium, and of theology. He died in 1028, and he was a great erudite, and he was maybe not as good, definitely, as Gerbert. He wasn't actually. He had also, philosophically speaking, he wasn't excessively refined, but he was very important because he also basically stated things like that the necessity, for instance, that reason to be submitted to faith and to revelation. He wrote actually also. He was a poet as well. He produced religious as well as profane poems, and his writings in prose are also kind of very famous, and famous letters, for instance, and which were considered the Patrologia Latina, essentially during the Middle Ages, as the model of epistolar style. And he was actually an elegant writer, even if very tied to kind of certain models that probably also limited his. And one of his most famous disciples was Berengar of Tours, among the others. And looking at the school that he organized, this was to live on as an extremely important center of learning, especially during the 12th century. The same Bernard of Tours was chancellor from 1119. Then eventually Theodoric was also very important. He died essentially in 1155, about those years. William of Conches, Bernardus Silvestris, Clarenbald of Arras. These were all essentially living in the second, from the end of the 11th to the second half of the 12th century. Well, maybe Clarenbald really not, but also John of Salisbury. It was extremely important. These were all figures that eventually contributed also eventually to the translation of all these texts that were coming from especially from Spain at this point, from Muslim Spain. They would organize these activities, also producing a kind of international net of translators of works from Greek and Arabic. I made extensive descriptions. There is one, can't remember now, should look at the playlists. Certain videos that deal essentially exactly with this. In medieval Christianity playlist, there is no, actually no, it's in medieval society, excuse me. Medieval society, which I can't always find these damn playlists. Here, yeah. 12th century Western translations from Greek and Arabic. Yeah, this was it. Chiefly also, but also the scientific revival of the West. 10th, 13th century, a point of medieval technology. That's kind of it deals with mostly scientific stuff, but it also explains what these figures did, also how important the school of Chartres was for this process of catalyzation of the works that were translated and that they were studied in here and and expanded in the rest of Europe, irradiated in the rest of Europe. There was no, maybe listing all the masters of Chartres is not so important, but the most important thing now was this a revival in the knowledge of classical authors. For dialectics, also grammatics was very important. The Donatus and Priscianus were some of the most important grammatical models. Then eventually there were these other, great authors of the classical world, like Virgilius, Servius, Cicero, Seneca, Boetius, Marcianus, Capella, Macrobius, Chalcidius, Augustine. That aspect, say, a marked attention towards the Platonic tradition, for which, in fact, the school of Chartres is often conceived as a sort of Platonic school. And this is objectively true, because at this point, by the way, the Christians usually knew they had this, especially in the West, this massive influence of St. Augustine that naturally was very influenced by Neoplatonism, and Aristotle was still not known largely, so this whole attempt to reconnect all the classical knowledge to Christianity was done through Neoplatonism, that has, by the way, also greater, evident. It's kind of easy to do, part of the reason why also great fathers of the church had been so influenced by Platonism is objectively had also a lot in common in many things together with Christianity. In its vision of the world, its ideal, its stressing of the spiritual and not material, this idea of ideal perfection in the skies from which everything kind of emanated. So naturally, this wasn't done mostly on the base of Plato. It was usually done, especially on the texts that were studied afterwards during the Middle Ages, on Plotinus, actually. And it was believed also because of the name similarity to have been Plato in the first place. Also, they're very similar, even though Plotinus adds, other conceptions in some ways. But and the practical of teaching was made up by the reading of the text, so the lectio, as it was called in Latin, and the commentary of the same text. So this is important because there was an exchange of also views on how this had to be interpreted. It wasn't really easy, and this process favored essentially the definition of certain scientific and cosmological doctrines and the delineation of a setting of problems and of say physical cosmological interests that basically extended towards the exegetic and theological reflection. And so up to that point, we have said how science really worked. I mean, nature was mostly observed, was essentially observed in a sort of kind of moral and allegorical fashion, that were at this point the idea was transforming towards a interpretational technique that wanted to look at reality as nature as a symbol of divine will, practically. And so the idea of nature as a great symbol that had to be explored, and that therefore required necessarily certain certain methods, certain means. So the according to Hago Saint Victor in the Tribus Diebus, the nature is the book written by the finger of God, and there was a great attention towards certain masters of Chartres, chiefly Theodoric, in the work De Sex Diarum Operibus, William of Conches in the Philosophia, Bernardus Silvestris in De Mundi Universitate, to center the reflection, to focus the reflection on the recognition of certain causal processes that basically regulate and order the whole cosmos. And in this, a central role was assumed by the cosmology. It was described into the Platonic Timaeus that was known and started principally in the text and comment that was preserved by Chalcidius. So in here there were many different let's say the direction remained within Neoplatonism, but these studies were essentially trying to criticize all of this and to create and to derive from it a greater system in a way, or at least to interpret the one that was presented now, but redefining it also according to a more, to an eminently Christian system. And naturally there were many problems into the process, because first of all, the techniques of interpretation were relatively poor at this point. They were actually only coming from the Bible. They were kind of symbolical and scriptural at the same time, and it was also very difficult to reconcile such ideas with the fundamentals of the Christian theological thought and the biblical text. So this was possibly the greatest challenge that the masters of Chartres were facing, because they had basically to renew completely the traditional exegesis. So started to make this extensive use of the interpretative technique of the so-called integumentum, so basically a sort of shadowing, that is the philosophical text, like Plato or Chalcidius, or the poetic one like Virgil or Boethius, were basically considered a sort of mean, a channel, if you want, a medium of truth that that had to be practically extrapolated from this this box through which it had been delivered, making it possible the conciliation, especially of the Timaeus, with the Christian doctrine of creation, that also posed in this many problems. So especially Theodoric centered his analysis on the relation between God and the world, that was basically explained through through the relation between respectively unity and multiplicity, and identical and different, and he enriched the let's say the Timaeus and Boeotian theme of the identification between unity and being, because so it says, Boethius, everything that is because it's one. It is because it's one. So through this, Theoric basically recurred. He basically reached the multiplicity of the creation to God through. He reconnects the multiplicity of creation through God by through essentially mathematical demonstrations, that were called arithmeticae probationes. So Theodoric basically commenced the Genesis on the base of physics and of basically the letter in itself, of what it meant as in meaning. According to William of Conches, instead, he was instead of mostly physician and philosopher, and according to him, God created certain causes that possess an ontologic consistency and proper causative capacities, like, for instance, the stars in inferior divinities, which in turn basically complete the work of the creation by forming the different beings and even the human body. So this was an extremely controversial position, and he was in fact accused also by the Cistercian mystics William of Saint-Thierry to be talking essentially physically of God. So William was accused of this, and because he was essentially making it kind of a material, objective explanation of creation and of universe and of the divine nature in a way that, in a sense, sounded too material, in fact. So the work of the masters of Chartres is complicated by many factors. So not just by the need to create an harmony between the Christian thought and pagan doctrines, but also to incorporate all this kind of practical knowledge that was coming from Arab science, essentially. And also the doctrines of the Book of the Causes, the Liber de Causas, and of other texts of Hermetic tradition that, for instance, have mostly to be found in the work of Bernardus Silvestris, and there is also this tendency to describe the cosmos basically through certain processes of participation, of immanence of the divine being. So that had been part of the Timaeus doctrines, especially in the comments of Chalcidius and Macrobius, and that basically makes an hypothesis of the divine, whose contents are basically the archetypical forms, and and as well as of the soul of the world, into which God basically becomes the being of all things that exist. That was basically an alternative to the exemplarist tradition of St. Augustine instead was in it's this would produce certain heresies. Also, we've talked. I made a video recently about Amalric of Bena. That's also in the medieval Christianity playlist. That was basically to create this very heterodox thinkings, for which he was eventually condemned, and this happened in because of the reflection that had started by the masters of Chartres. So certain this, especially the relation between gods and objects and reality, was intended in a kind of in monistic and pantheistic views that eventually inspired the works of David, the teaching especially of David de Dinan and Amalric of Bena, that were essentially the extremes of the tradition of Chartres, of the masters of Chartres, and that were not to be essentially were not to be tolerated. In fact, most of this teaching basically were kind of in the shadow at a point, because especially in the case of Amalric of Bena, the process against him was he was processed, he was under trial also in life, but he basically refused his theories, but eventually it was discovered after his death there was plenty of different disciples of his that were now spreading in turn in the school these ideas that were eventually by admission reconnected to the master. So this was a kind of a problem, naturally, because you understand that that what I was saying before, that there was a kind of lack of control sometimes. And in that case, eventually the church managed to contain it. These theories were condemned, and eventually but the problem, in fact, is also that we don't know very much about these theories in practice. I mean, of this, at least of this kind of last two extremes, exactly because of the damnatio memoriae that eventually was done of them. And this wasn't naturally a very comforting thing, but at the same time it shows also the problems that were starting now, because at that point it wasn't just about a single scholar that was, venturing in this field and wanting essentially to know more, or to just to read books. Now these were theories that were being formulated on the base of kind of complex philosophical systems that had an evident capacity of irradiation, that were even taught in the same schools of theology, and therefore were causing a very very serious problem, because these theories could spread and were essentially spreading from kind of the best schools, from the best channels. So the risk was to create a new generation of scholars that was completely heretical and start to go straight from doctrine, and this posed problems, especially into a moment where other heresies were spreading basically all over, and these new theories could back them essentially, or at least could be used as even as just an example of someone who basically went astray, and was showing that what Rome was saying was not all that existed. Naturally, it's a much less it's a much more complicated thing now to explain, because it's not really a matter of Rome, what Rome thought. Actually, Rome, most of its history was at this point very very orthodox in thinking. The main problem with Rome now, what was the Gregorian reform had brought to us in terms of the papal prerogatives, and so on. But these were mostly scientifically oriented views. So it wasn't just a matter of Rome controlling what had to be taught. Christian theology, Christian doctrine at that point was kind of, nobody had posed the problem, in fact, of creating another system. Think about the Aristotelic Ptolemaic system. That is something that was created at a point because that was a world that needed that worldview. The worldview at this time was something extremely primitive, also in the essential. So also these philosophical systems eventually were absorbed by the church because they were objectively very effective. They could back the and this is what with scholastics. We actually never spoke about scholastics openly on Schwerpunkt, but we'll have to do it to explain how it really happened. But it up to this point, the main problem was really having theological schools who went out of control, that could expand also in other fields, because this is the problem also with Amalric of Bena, that we don't really know what he taught, but it's evident that such premises could lead to taking other paths. Also in criticism towards the papal superiority and so on. So this had to be controlled pretty seriously. Okay, so aside from this, now I don't know how this video turned out, but this is another chapter, and I would like to leave you with the general reflection how certain phenomena are always kind of related to certain contexts, but at the same time there is always a personality that makes the difference, and it's very important to see how from such early times such movements, such ideas, such circles, such schools were forming for a reason, and for a guidance, and for a model that were influent and were to basically expand at this point. As the European continent at this point, as a society, as political, what was expanding was essentially becoming something very very complex, very fast for those time standards. So for now, I actually didn't wish you happy Easter, but I do it now. For the rest, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.